Chapter 14 3 Arrows. We remained in this camp for several days. Our stay was brought to an end by lack of game. Once more the tribe was on the move, and once again we were on the grueling march. We had now learnt how to protect ourselves against the sun with straw mats. The Indians used them in the shape of coolies' hats to hang down their backs between the load and their shoulders. We used them as sunshades hanging from our hats or sticking out from our knapsacks to protect the nape of the neck. Our equipment had become of the most varied character: sign cameras, photometers, canteens, firearms, first aid kit, including snake bite serum, a change of clothing, maps, quite useless, needle and thread, a storm-proof lighter, food comprising exclusively tea, beans, coconuts, and maize, native necklaces and other things of ethnological interest, and numbers of rolls of exposed and unexposed film. In all, Norma usually carried a load of some 35 pounds, and I about 55. The weight does not seem excessive if you think of it when seated in a comfortable armchair. If you try walking with it for interminable hours, drenched in perspiration and with the straps continually cutting into your flesh, and never know where you're going and when you're going to stop, it seems a great deal heavier. Thus, when camp number 2 had been succeeded by 7 more day after day, week in and week out, our energies reached the limit of exhaustion. Camp number 10 was deplorable. The water was dirty and scarce. To obtain it called for the patience of a saint. The place of the spring was surrounded by tall trees with thin trunks and yellow leaves. The soil was largely clay or marl in semi-marshland, and in the middle of this bog was the water hole. The spring was a mere thread of water which was clear only above the mud. Before one could fill a container, one had to wade through the bog, dig a hole in the clay with a stick, and wait for the mud to subside beneath the flow. The water had a nauseating taste, and we could just manage to get it down us in the form of rankly flavored tea. The camp was set up on this particular site deliberately. Some 2 miles away there was a limpid brook where game abounded which must not be scared away. This period of prosperity for the tribe was not without difficulties for me. In the early hours of the afternoon, the chief, who, on account of his exalted rank, did not go out hunting, lay down on his mat and sent for me. He made me lie down beside him, and embracing me effusively, called me his friend, and would not let me go until he had no further use for me. At first I had visions of obtaining valuable information from him, but no sooner did I broach some subject that particularly intrigued me, such as how many encounters he had had with the white man, whether he remembered how many such encounters there had been in his father's time, what he considered the most outstanding feats of his tribe, and many other subjects of which I was longing to know more. Then he changed the subject altogether. I referred to the next rainy season, wondering whether there would be plenty of palm trees bearing the tasty shoots, or whether there would be some more raspadura. It was obvious that his senses warned him to be weary of the white man, and I was supposed to be his friend. The weariness of the tribe showed in the women. They had given up their principal act of coquetry, the practice of plucking the hairs from their faces and bodies, which they did with extraordinary skill, using only the nails of their thumbs and index fingers. But now that game was plentiful once more, so that the tribe would stay for some time in the same place, The women eagerly devoted themselves once more to this aspect of their toilet. At all hours of the day Norma was in demand among the women, and amid coy whisperings and girlish giggles they would come into the hut and confabulate with my wife. I was obviously in the way. If by chance a woman passed and repassed in front of the door of our Maloka, without daring to enter, it was a sign that it was time for me to go out and leave the coast clear for the shy one to come in. She evidently had some woman's business to discuss with my wife. I discovered that the reason for this solicitude was a magnifying mirror we had. Female vanity brought them in search of it, so that they could examine minutely every part of their bodies and make sure that not one trace of down had escaped their rigorous process of depilation. I was afraid that my rest would be permanently interrupted if the men also found out about this interesting possession of ours. Fortunately, it did not happen. Now, busy once more at their vital occupation of hunting, they had no time to bother about appearances. Besides, I think the girls were cute enough to keep the secret find to themselves. During our sojourn in this camp, the child nephew of the witch doctor became ill. His uncle, whom we had always regarded as sour vinegar, became a man distracted with grief. He tried everything in his repertoire of treatments in an effort to heal the boy, from making gashes in him with tacuara cane to saturating with smoke the hut in which the patient lay. He even called the clan together for an evening dance dedicated to driving away evil spirits. They carried the sick child out on the mat and laid him in front of the fire. Those who were taking part in the ritual formed a circle around him, and armed with spears began to dance, gradually narrowing the circle more and more, while the witch doctor made passes with his hands over the recumbent child. When the circle had closed up tightly and the dancers were elbow to elbow, the chanting ceased and a frightful caterwauling broke out to scare away the evil spirit. As in all such ceremonies, they then resorted to the threat of force, and raising their arms, they ordered the spirit to leave the child or be run through with their spears. Without waiting to find out whether their threat has had any effect, they ended the rite, and the boy was carried back into the hut. We knew why they did not call upon our services. The witch doctor would feel his amour propre offended at the very thought of any intervention by those whom he abhorred. We prudently decided not to run the risk of playing the Good Samaritan. We knew that if we offered to help and failed to save the child, the tribe would hold us responsible, and as to the consequence of being accused of causing the boy's death, we preferred to remain in ignorance. Therefore, we were extremely surprised when the witch doctor paid us an untimely visit. He brought 2 magnificent spears, bundles of arrows, a polished bow, 2 necklaces, and a number of other adornments. With a certain diffidence he deposited them all in our hut, telling us that as he knew how much we valued these things, he would give them to us if we would help to cure his nephew, Te Rio. We made a deal with him. He was to take all the things away, and we would go and see the boy. If we could cure him, it would be the witch doctor himself, and not we who would have done so. His dull old eyes lighted up with an unaccustomed vivacity. It must have been a great blow to his pride to have been obliged to seek our collaboration. I need hardly add that in making that agreement we were not in the least concerned about the witch doctor's prestige, but very decidedly anxious about our own personal safety. The little fellow was suffering from malaria. A few doses of araline were sufficient to afford him temporary relief, notwithstanding that the witch doctor distrusted the tablets and believed that injections would be much more effective, since in nearly all the other forms of medical treatment he had observed that patients were given injectable remedies, and besides there was something comparable in giving an injection to his own style of operating with sharpened Takuara canes. Not long after the child's complete recovery, there appeared in our hut 2 beautifully made necklaces, really outstanding specimens of savant artistry. The witch doctor never alluded to his act of secret gratitude. Indeed, we would never have thought him capable of such a sentiment if destiny had not exposed us to a perilous ordeal. My apprenticeship in the business of building savant huts was handicapped by lack of materials. Who would have imagined some months before that the biggest problem a civilized man would have to face in the 20th century was that of finding buriti, or shishao, palm leaves. As we left the various campsites, we generally did so with a certain measure of regret, and were promptly confronted by a fresh batch of troubles. Game got scarce again, and we were involved once more in the vicissitudes of the great tribe in a migration covering hundreds of miles. According to my calculations, which were crudely based upon observations of the sun's position, we had been describing a great ellipse in relation to the river of the dead. Now we were gently straightening out east-southeast. If we continued like this, we would come upon the river again. The vast spread of the Mato Grosso offered an endless repetition of landscapes, now desert, now marshland, now fertile with sparse vegetation. The mistiness of the sky increased from day to day, but the sun, even when covered by tenuous clouds, irradiated the same intense heat. The nights were hotter now. We no longer shivered with cold or had to get up and tend the fire in order to keep warm. The tribe made full use of food, as the jungle provided, from certain ants of a pink color to the murisi and the chatoba, watery fruits with a sweet taste. The Indian women took zealous care of the parrots, their feathers being in such constant demand to equip the arrows used in hunting. During the marches they perched on top of the women's loads, indifferent to the swaying and jolting and to everything going on around them. They were an amusing travesty of what they once had been, tailless, almost without feathers, only their heads retained something of their former arrogance. A woman gave birth somewhere along the road. According to Prena, the Indian mother went off to the side of the path, delivered herself of the baby, and severed the umbilical cord with her teeth. The father daubed his offspring with red paint, and they all 3 continued on their way. The joy of the parents at this happy event belonged to them alone, not to the tribe or even to the clan. And the man showed remarkable consideration for his wife. On his own back he carried not only his bundle of arrows, his spear, and his mat, but heavy bags of household utensils which in normal circumstances were borne by the woman. This particular woman was a friend of Norma's. She marched on with joyful pride, carrying her newly born in a basket at her back. It had become a habit of ours to refer to the chief's clan as the royal family. It was not that they enjoyed any particular privileges, except such few as pertained to the chief himself, but from the moral point of view they enjoyed a distinct prestige in the hunting and the dances, and all the ceremonial, and in the matter of guard duty. The men of the chief's clan were treated with signal respect, and ranked equally with captains of the highest order. Our situation as protégés of this clan normally precluded us from forming any attachments of an intimate character with other families. But as our circle of acquaintances expanded, and since we were not so inflexibly bound by this tribal rigidity as the savants themselves, we noticed that the majority of the Indians believed that we must have plenty of food among our equipment, and that we were the only people in the tribe able to feed regularly and frequently. Their respect for the rights of others prevented them from verifying such an opinion. In order to dispel this erroneous conception, we must have made us appear to their eyes greedy or niggardly. We showed them the contents of our baggage and let them see how hard up we were. They could not believe what they saw and heard concerning our food problem. The astonishing news spread with unusual rapidity, not so much because they were very interested in all our difficulties, as because they had always imagined that the white man had food in abundance. If anything were needed to strengthen the bond between us and the tribe, this revelation of ours provided the link. The following day we were stepping out on one of the periodical marches, and were just about to overtake an Indian woman. She stopped us and gave Norma a handful of tiny coconuts. We thought at first that this was merely due to some sudden impulse, but when one family after another of our acquaintance repeated the gesture, we realized it had to do with what they had learnt of our hardships the day before. We were presented with toasted maize, palm shoots, little maize loaves, delicious to the taste, ants, fruit, and grasshoppers. We were wholly unable to repay this generosity. However, some of the presents were passed on to others whose stomachs were less exacting than ours. So it was that this new demonstration of loyal and disinterested friendship, which we found most moving, enabled us at last to leave the pangs of hunger behind. I had lost count of the huts I had had to build, but we still kept going. Now we were approaching a fertile zone. Different from all the others, there was dense vegetation and trees with light grayish trunks thrusting up into twisted arcs in their search for the sun. I ought to have guessed what was coming. The branch of a wide and deep rivulet blocked our path. The warriors hurled themselves into the dirty water without demur, using their bundles of arrows tied to their mats as a float. They steadied it with the left hand and struck out with the right in a sort of one-armed breaststroke. In this way they reached the other bank without difficulty. The loads carried by the women and our own equipment called for other means of transportation, and the sound of innumerable stone axe blows indicated the men were constructing rafts. They were simple 6 or 7 tree trunks bound together with fiber or bark and pushed into the stream. The diminutive area of the craft, which remained above the water, was loaded with no thought for safety or equilibrium. To propel them across the stream, several savants swam beside them, guiding them towards the opposite bank. The women, too, were ferried across in this way, more wet than dry. We and our equipment found our way across the river in like manner, fortunately without disaster which would have ruined what little remained of our original paraphernalia. Norma took a plunge into the water through trying to step off the raft too soon. When she got out, she informed me that she had felt something bite her thigh below her bathing costume, and on the upper part of the back of her leg were 2 round, bleeding wounds. Piranhas, fortunately only 2 in number and quite small ones, had left their mark. The two perfect concentric circles, cut with diabolical precision by the needle-sharp teeth of the fish which swam in the Mato Grosso rivers. I applied an emergency dressing of all the hundreds of people who waded across that piece of water. It had to be Norma that the piranhas attacked. Perhaps it was the whiteness of her skin that attracted them. It would be rash to try to assess the average life expectancy of Indians. The factors that contribute to lengthening or shortening their lives are so diverse. In the case of Indians who live in proximity to the white man, the lifespan is generally extremely short, owing to alcoholic excess and the inordinate use of tobacco. The Indians I had met on the fringes of the jungle of Bolivia, Paraguay, Peru, and Ecuador had no conception of civilized man's respect for moderation and the use of these artificial stimulants. Perhaps I should add that many civilized men in those faraway places have no conception of moderation in this respect either. When they drink, they get thoroughly drunk, and when they smoke, they can go on until they literally fall into a crazy stupor. On the other hand, the Indian who is not affected by these contacts has a much better chance of relative longevity. If he belongs to a tribe of sedentary habits, he may have an average life expectancy of 50 years or more, provided that in his ceremonial alcoholic drinks, usually of high fermentation, with a base of maize, pecoy, or some other fruit, are not indulged to too great an extent, and if the use of his homegrown tobacco does not constitute a daily habit but is reserved for special occasions. Just as the smallest doses of antibiotics produce a surprising effect in the treatment of the Indian's ailments, so even the slightest quantity of spirituous liquor can do them tremendous harm. In nomadic tribes, such as the savants, their longevity depends to a great extent upon nature. In benign conditions, in which famine does not recur too frequently, or for too prolonged a period, the savant, owing to his robust constitution, his diet, and his wholesome way of living, free from tobacco and alcoholic drink, will reach 55 or 60 years of age, but it is generally only chiefs and captains of great renown who are privileged to reach beyond the age of 60. The reason why this is so is no doubt that by virtue of their exalted rank they are released from the necessity of wearing themselves out with the exhausting privations of hunting, and also that, being permitted to have several wives, they are better looked after and live in greater comfort. Unless some abnormal element supervenes, such as heavy rains, lengthy spells of inclement weather, total absence of game, and therefore long and wearying forced marches, the average savant lives at least to the age of 50. However, if an epidemic overtakes them, there is the risk that very few members of the tribe will survive. The unhygienic conditions in which they live, and their pristine constitution, unfortified and defenseless against unfamiliar germs, such as measles and smallpox, may result in their being decimated by an epidemic as completely as if the tribe had never existed. An epidemic of any foreign disease could easily annihilate the savant. The savant woman, by reason of the exhaustingly strenuous life she leads, lives 5 to 10 years less than the male. For this anomaly, which leaves the mature male without a spouse, there are two alternative solutions. If the widower is a notable captain who is still sufficiently potent to beget descendants, he is provided with another wife. Otherwise, the women of his clan attend to his necessities in common. To solve his sexual problems, the male who does not remarry is obliged to seek consolation among the widows. Sometimes, but only in exceptional cases when the Indian concerned is a sufficiently outstanding personality, the council may provide an elderly captain with a young girl to take care of him and to warm him with her body in the cold nights. The very fact of an old man's being awarded this privilege signalizes him at once as a person of rare qualities. In fact, Prenaw's father was the only man in the whole tribe outside of the chief's clan who enjoyed such attention. He was a lean old man, covered with scars, tall and about 60 years of age. He walked with a limp, and his head was permanently inclined to one side. The expression of his eyes was deep and penetrating. He was constantly attended by his youthful wife, a lovely girl of about 16. On the first days of the tribe's exodus, we had noticed him limping and hobbling, one painful step at a time. Yet his stamina and vitality astounded us as he contrived to keep going without falling behind. His wife walked at his side, helping him along. She carried no load whatever. Her sole duty was to assist the old captain, who used her to lean upon whenever he paused for rest. This brought clearly home to me the fact that the savants do not abandon their old people when it becomes imperative to them to give up their work. Savant customs, even though primitive and indigenous to a nation of warriors, are guided by an ennobling human sentiment. Every other day we changed camp. We were now unmistakably heading west. Whenever I asked how far we were from the River of the Dead, I received the same reply: "Rup to Redi, very near." The first indication that we were really close to the great river, Og Ajodi, was the low-lying, desolate region with extensive fens and bogs. The legacy of the rainy season and the overflow of small tributaries of the Rio das Mortes, we skirted this zone by traveling over high ground surrounded by forest of tacuara, bamboo trees, but ended up by entering muddy chocolate-brown waters which came up to our waist and chests. We went barefoot. We had our bathing costumes on under other clothing, which we took off so that it would not get wet. When we had repeated this same process a dozen times, we decided to keep our bathing costumes on only and not bother about wearing anything else. Walking on the mud at the bottom of these marshes, which clung to the soles of the feet, was singularly disagreeable. We moved through the water slowly, and when it reached our chest, we had to take the utmost care not to splash the equipment we were carrying on our heads. The sun did not penetrate to these great boggy lagoons, which made them seem mysterious and repulsive. We stilled our imagination by concentrating firmly upon the care of the cinematograph equipment, but we shuddered if our feet so much as touched against a root. Boa constrictors, poisonous stinging rays, electric eels, and piranhas were the least of the evils that assailed our thoughts as we groped our way slowly over the slimy mud. Our knapsacks prevented us from turning or bending our heads to any extent, and this upset our sense of equilibrium. Not only ourselves, but the Indians also were repelled and apprehensive of these still turbid waters. They put arrows to their bows, held ready to shoot at anything at all. The women complained about the weight of their loads, but in reality were relieving their subconscious fears. At the end of the day, our nerves were on edge, and consequently our bodies exhausted. We had left behind us some 30 bogs and lagoons. Pray Na came somewhat officiously to inform me as to those we should be encountering the following day. I closed my ears. I preferred not to know. Even today, when I think of them, I can still feel their sinister influence. My flesh creeps as though some damp, slimy serpent were squirming over me. On the following stage of our nightmare journey, we had not even had time to warm ourselves by walking before we had to cross the cold waters of another lagoon. I felt a flutter at my heart as I glanced at Norma, who, without a murmur of complaint, was stoically unlacing her shoes for yet another of those dreadful ordeals. She looked up at me and smiled. We held the same thoughts as on the previous day, which were aggravated by the misty vapor that rose from the surface of the lagoon, concealing its true extent and hiding the rotting tree trunks that sprouted from it like menacing spears. The laughter of the women and what it signified lifted, as if by magic, a crushing weight of oppression from our minds. Now at last we had come to the end of these ghastly marshes. The new camp was pitched a stone's throw from the margin of the great river. Our joy knew no bounds. The river of the dead was an old acquaintance. We mounted the slippery cliff bank, roofed with trees, and came on to a straight, narrow path lined with woods of daikura. Norma was walking ahead, hastening to get out of the labyrinth of trees so depressingly sunless and saturated with moisture, when suddenly she uttered a cry and gave a start. I grabbed my carbine and rushed to the rescue, but already an Indian had acted with incredible rapidity, his bow at the ready, as it had been throughout the crossing of the bog. He had shot an arrow towards the ground between the grass and the daikura canes. Transfixed by the arrow, the tail of a venomous snake was thrashing violently. 2 more shots smashed the creature's triangular head. Norma, pale and trembling, showed me her right instep. 2 bleeding pinpricks showed where the reptile had bitten her. There was no time to lose. I applied a tourniquet to her calf and took the snake-bite serum out of the first aid kit in my knapsack. To my horror, a brownish stain was all that was left of the amber liquid. It had evaporated in the excessive heat. Our large medicine chest, which the Indians were carrying together with the bulk of our equipment, was away at the head of the column, too far away to be reached without fatal delay. In despair, I was preparing to suck out the poison when the witch doctor stepped in front of me and did just that. He sucked and spat 3 times, and then, with a pointed daikura stick, delicately made a score of incisions. Blackish blood spurted from the gashes. Norma breathed no complaint, but merely bit her lower lip. Irresolute, not knowing what to do, I let the witch doctor take over. What he was doing seemed to be the right thing. When I eventually got the medicine chest and examined the phials of snakebite serum, I found that they were all in bad condition. We were entirely in the hands of the witch doctor. Surrounded by women who examined the snake a yard and then looked at Norma and tutted with anxiety, the witch doctor was manifestly conscious of his importance and fully aware of his opportunity. A hand was placed on my shoulder. It was the chief. I flashed him a look of gratitude for his concern, and I kept my fingers crossed that the witch doctor would not confound his sensible treatment with any nonsensical jiggery-pockery. Once more he cut thin lines around the afflicted part. The blood that flowed this time was a little less dark, but still thick. He drew out his bamiri, some reddish-colored leaves, chewed them thoroughly to extract the juice, and tied them around the bite. Then, without looking at me, he rose and went away. With a mat and a couple of spears, we made a litter on which to carry Norma. Her eyes tearful with pain, she nevertheless perked up to comment that if she had known that she would travel so comfortably, she would have got herself bitten earlier. The village was not the one we had known, with Fabre and Ureta. A new one had been constructed several miles upstream. For once I was aided in my attempts to build our hut. I left Norma lying beside the equipment, and after having improvised a roof over our head to shade her from the sun, I was setting out in search of material for the hut, when the chief stopped me and sent his wives instead. I comforted Norma, who must have been suffering intense pain, as I struggled to dissimulate my own fears. Children, women, and a warrior, now and then, who came to pay us a visit, with obvious concern, relieved me from the necessity to hide the dread that was gnawing at my mind. As evening fell, Norma's condition became worse. She lay prostrate in the hut upon a soft mattress of tender echu palm leaves, sweating copiously. She had a temperature of 102. Her pulse was rapid. Worried to death, I gave her a stimulant, and went off to find the witch doctor. The old Indian whom I had laughed at days before, as I thought of his extraordinary cures and dressings, was now a comfort to me, and I had more faith in his red leaves than in all the gamut of civilization's pharmacopoeia. He came willingly. He seemed to feel responsible for the patient. The savant looked at Norma's face and then at the bandage of leaves and made a sign to indicate that he was going. I did not try to stop him. Somehow the dread of a negative response kept me rooted to the spot. Norma slept uneasily and was every now and then in a delirium. By dawn her fever had risen to 105. Part of her calf was a deep purple color. Apparently the tourniquet had not been tight enough to keep down the poison that had remained. It was scarcely daylight when the witch doctor came. He brought a bas-mi-ri containing the reddish leaves. Again he subjected the wounds, the edges of which were two bright violet marks, to more gashes. The blood that issued from them was still thick and dark. He chewed more leaves and applied them like a poultice stuck on with blood and saliva, but not tied. When the witch doctor went away, the chief arrived. He sat on a mat and in plaintive tones moaned sorrowfully for some time. I had not the heart to tell him that his wailing made us feel worse rather than better. My wife was in such a fever that she did not notice it. When I went outside to see him off, I discovered that we had a fire burning and a goodly store of firewood. My gratitude to the tribe enabled me to forget my anguish for a few minutes. By evening, Norma's instep and calf had swollen to twice their normal size. Sometimes she sank for a few moments into an unconscious lethargy. At others she was delirious for a while, or suddenly recovered lucidity of mind, only to sink again into a coma. 3 times the witch doctor visited us. At midnight, in the glow from the fire outside, Norma asked me for water. I gave it to her and touched her forehead. It was like a burning ember. When I looked at her foot, I could not suppress a shudder. It was a swollen, deformed mass of flesh, and the toenails could not be seen. When day broke, she was breathing unevenly, but her skin had lost its corpse-like pallor. Her pulse was almost normal. Her temperature was still 102. I harbored stronger hopes of her recovery, but the sight of her foot made me doubt that there could be a speedy and complete cure. Gangrene was now the chief danger. The witch doctor entered, and, ignoring me completely, changed the poultice, but did not make any fresh incisions in the wound or the flesh around it. That afternoon Norma returned to the land of living. She actually had an appetite. After a meal of pace, a small, very tasty rodent, which was a personal present from the chief, and a few palm shoots, she drank a considerable quantity of unsweetened tea, and slept like a baby. Contrary to what I expected, her temperature went down. On the 3rd day, the improvement was more marked. All that worried me now was her foot. It was still tremendously swollen and a grayish-purple in color. This time the old Indian confined himself to pricking the foot in several places and pressing it gently. Each time he applied pressure, he watched Norma's face. If she showed signs of pain, he pricked the foot in another place with his pointed stick. He applied no more poultices and left without a word. In one of the parts of the foot which the witch doctor had treated, the swelling subsided, and the area was covered with what looked like tiny blisters. That night Norma's fever had abated, and I was able to close my eyes for the first time. The witch doctor did not come any more. When I went to see him and offer him what I thought would be a very acceptable present in appreciation of his inestimable services, he asked me to return the 2 necklaces he had given me. I did so. The Indian wanted neither my gratitude nor my friendship. He had repaid his debt. We were quits at last. Now he had the right to go on hating us. Norma recovered in a matter of days. A period of prolonged rest restored her strength. Pio-chi, the irritable wife of Prena, had taken us under her wing. She brought me water, firewood, and food, sharing with us the game that her husband secured in his hunting expeditions. Other women left us every day varied tokens of friendship, small coconuts, palmitos, maize, and wild string beans. Norma's misfortune, now that the danger had passed, showed itself to have been a blessing in disguise. It was not only the food we were given that led us to think so, but much more because the friendly indifference of old had become transformed into genuine affection. The tribe awoke from its lethargy toward us and treated us with the consideration it would show to any respected member when in trouble. The chief came to see Norma every afternoon and smiled at her to cheer her up. Now he no longer lifted the lid of our saucepan and sniffed at our meal as a sign that he expected to be invited to share it. Now he brought us as presents small hollow pumpkins containing wild honey. Although the sight of the river of the dead had played us a mean trick, I felt an inexplicable sense of joy. Its appearance had changed. The water was crystal clear, showing the sand on the river bed, and its current was less violent. At this time of year, the flow of the water was only half the volume that we had known before, but it seemed to run faster. From the lofty, overhanging banks, clods of sand and soil were continually dropping from the riverside, was dry and brittle and crumbled for want of humidity to hold it together. Wild and wayward as it was, the river was yet the road to civilization. I thought my eyes must be deceiving me, but no, there it was, the archaic, feeble canoe that had brought us. As I would have greeted an old and cherished friend, I ran towards it. It was just the same, with its disturbing look of insecurity, and with the hole in its stern, from which the board I had patched it with had disappeared. The cracks caused by the heat ran from stem to stern. I filled it with water and, tying it to a tree, left it lying in a backwater, to be of service to us again when the time for our departure came. The canoe had been brought back by order of the chief of the former Zavant village. 2 weeks' rest made sufficient improvement in Norma's condition for her to be able to think of going home. When she walked about, she limped a little. When she set foot outside the hut, many of the people in the village came to greet her. There was a temporary additional worry. She could not see so well as before. The effect of the snake-bite poison persisted for some time and affected her sight, but little by little she returned to normal without the help of medical science. Without haste we started getting our things together, tying and untying mats stuffed with arrows, for it was a rare thing for a day to go by without some warrior making us a present of an arrow or two. When this honor was paid me, I had to return the compliment by examining with a critical eye the length and straightness of the shaft, try the point with my thumb, nod knowingly, and make suitable signs of approbation. Only then was the warrior satisfied that his craftsmanship was well appreciated, and he could retire satisfied. If the journey downriver with Ureta and Saure had been a problem, I did not care to think about what it would be like going upstream against that terrible current with 4 savants who had never rowed before. But there was no use worrying about it, and I felt that by now I had had enough experience of surprises in the jungle territory not to let such things depress me. That evening prior to our departure we said our more intimate goodbyes to the savants. The sun was beginning to swathe the center of the village in shadows. tinting the dust with gold. The warriors were going their rounds chanting the Song of Evening, while the councils assembled for their deliberations. The women were bringing the last gourds of water from the river, their naked flesh still gleaming wet from their recent dip. The younger children were scampering about at play, some of them trying to deceive each other by simulating the drone of the Vidu, the great wasp. The smoke of liewood reached my nostrils, mingled with the tempting aroma of roast meat. I found myself smiling with a deep sense of satisfaction. Hunger was nothing but an ugly memory, and as if it were identified with the tribe itself, the smell of meat was acting like a tonic to my spirits. A strange sensation took possession of me, and I cannot say whether it was the smoke or my feelings that made me put my handkerchief to my eyes. We prepared to go to sleep, or rather to let our fancy roam over the teeming memories that united us to this great tribe, and to contrast their simple radiant happiness with the complex vanities that bound us to our civilized world. Suddenly a silent, shadowy outline appeared between the opening that served as a doorway and the fire outside. I sat up cautiously. The old antipathy toward us still persisted in a few members of the tribe. It was the chief. He called me as usual by name, which he could never manage to pronounce correctly. Instead of saying Dardo, he pronounced it Drado. Similarly, in addressing my wife, he did not say Norma, but something between Neuroma and Droma. He poked up the fire, and we sat down side by side. The famous, dreaded chief of the great savant parent village hesitated before he spoke. When he had made up his mind to begin, he spoke in a whisper. He remarked that when the sun came up, our trails would separate. He hoped there would be no shortage of game in my country, and that I should find my clan without tears of sadness, mourning for a bereavement. I listened to him without saying a word, hanging upon the meaning of his utterances, and conscious of the deference he was showing me. In the usual savant way, he did not pause. He looked behind him and handed me 3 arrows wrapped in a deerskin. I knew these arrows well, for I had often looked long at them sticking out of the straw, with others like them, near where he spread his mat in his maloka. They were bound with the skins of rattlesnakes, and adorned with pink feathers. Their points were of a hard violet-colored wood, where the points were united with the shafts projecting long black hairs and appendages of rattlesnakes' tails. They measured 6 feet in length. Without wishing to refuse this valuable present, I made signs to the chief to take them back, as I considered them too good to give away. He smiled and laid a hand on my shoulder. He looked at me closely for a few seconds with his calm black eyes, and then went on speaking. He told me that if at any time I found my hut surrounded by evil spirits, I should use these arrows against them, and I could be certain they would go away. His demonstration of friendship and affection robbed me of speech and of all traces of the ethnologist's curiosity. That I forgot momentarily my scientific mission left me with no regrets afterwards, for I have cherished and will always cherish those minutes of intimacy with a proud chief whose legendary fame has woven the most fantastic legends around his person, and for whose sincerity, probity, and esteem I have the highest respect. I sought eagerly for some object with which to reciprocate his magnanimity. I could find nothing. He had never had much interest in any of our belongings. The raspadura, which was the only thing for which he had a particular predilection, had long since run out. He exclaimed, "Come back to hunt some other time. There will be a hut for you at my side." He tossed some logs onto the fire and left me. I sat there a long while, deep in thought. In the afternoon and evening I had said farewell to the village. Now I was taking my leave of its noble loyalty. Norma called me to come and tell her about the interview. I cast a glance around the village. The fire was lighting up the straw walls of our shelter with an orange glint. A little farther away, the profiles of the village huts stood out against a sky white with stars. In the distance could be heard the periodical barking of the sentinels alert. Of all that material we selected in Zavantina to take with us, there remained almost nothing but the empties. Nevertheless, once again the fragile canoe succumbed to an excessive load. Baskets of meat and fruit made up for the deficiencies of our equipment. With our Indian utensils and our arrows, not to mention the weapons of the 4 warriors, it looked like a canoe on a war footing. While I was loading it, I wasted a good deal of time in trying to get rid of some long-legged spiders that had made their home in the craft. When I threw them away, they crawled back very ostentatiously over the water and climbed rapidly up the sides and into the canoe again. This game went on for quite a while until I gave up and decided to admit the stowaways as passengers. Our Zavant companions who were to make the journey with us all tried to come aboard at once, which made the water pour in over the sides. If I had not taken the trouble to make a protective screen of branches for the equipment, it would have undergone another baptism. The warriors understood my reasoning, and the ducking they got spoke clearer than words. It was arranged that 2 of them should go along the bank of the river, while the other 2 should propel the canoe along by pushing with the singa, a long pole that was stuck into the river bed, and it was hoped that with the combined operations of the 2 men pushing or pulling from the side, and the 2 men in the canoe performing their punt-like method of propulsion, we should succeed in overcoming the impact of the contrary current. The 2 pairs were to take it in turns to push, pull, or shove. The chief made no reference to our departure from the top of the high bank, accompanied by his escort. He watched us unemotionally, but he remembered, and I remembered, those moments of the night before. The tribe had gathered all along the river bank, in contrast to the grave faces of the men, the women, and the young girls, who were Norma's special friends, hung around her neck, hugging and patting her. Her immaculate white blouse, which she had been saving for this great day, was stained red with their paint. In the grief of parting, tears were streaming down her cheeks. We climbed into the canoe and busied ourselves fighting the current with oars, poles, and pushings from the side. The warrior's inexperience and my own enfeebled efforts barely succeeded in budging the clumsy craft more than a few yards. The 2 Zavants outside, on seeing how fruitless our combined efforts were, simply sat down and laughed at the spectacle. Some children joined in the mirth and shouted to us that we had better walk. The Zavants sprang out of the canoe and angrily seized their bows. Their warrior's dignity was being affronted by public ridicule because they were obliged to travel in a contrivance that incited the tribe to hilarity. The peremptory intervention of the chief caused them to return at once. Peevish and stung, their anger doubled their energies, and somehow or other we managed to make headway upstream in a fierce and exhausting struggle. If it had not been that I had to return the canoe, I would have followed the unanimous advice of the tribe and walked. The rapids which before had made our hearts come up into our mouths, we now passed with little difficulty, girding ourselves to the canoe and wading through the water up to our knees. We had to beware of the venomous stinging ray, which generally lurks under a cloak of sand. More than once the stinga, with which we explored the river bed, vibrated with the sudden lash of the tail of some fleeting fish. The enormously wearying task of having to struggle continually against the powerful current made us take frequent rests. We were moving upstream, inch by inch, 1 second's distraction meant losing several yards gained by the sweat of our brows. Even on the lookout, ever with the ropes hauled taut from the riverside, and the singa, and the oars in perpetual motion, we were fighting our way laboriously onward. The savants who accompanied us were possessed of real verve and spirit, and they never slackened their pulling or their showing until I indicated it was time for rest. They were silent and willing. I envied them their immense vigor. One evening, as we were making camp on a narrow fringe of stony ground, bordered on one side by the river and the other by bushes with thick foliage, the sun had just gone down when hundreds of bats besieged us from all sides. They grazed past us like arrows, almost brushing our faces or bodies as they swooped madly about. Their whistling noises and the flutter of their wings were so disagreeable that we preferred to move away from the equipment and the canoe and penetrate some distance into the jungle to elude them and get some sleep. The days passed laboriously with a nightmare quality. Reaching the tribe of the River of the Dead, we were received as visitors of some prestige by virtue of our having lived in the parent village. We built up our strength for some days, which, with the kindly assistance of the missionary fathers, who welcomed and congratulated us. From there on we continued our journey with warriors of this tribe, because of the mortal enmity that existed between those of the parent village and the tribe near Savantina. Once again we had Ureta as our guide, our old and esteemed friend. Not Fabre, however, who, remembering the overturning of our canoe and the long days of hunger, opted to remain at home. As we approached the limits of the village where Chief Iribuena and his tribe dwelt, we wondered how he would feel about where we had been, but the savants were out on a great hunting expedition many miles away. Savantina stood out dazzlingly, with its clean white buildings. The townspeople were astonished at our return, which they had considered an impossibility. Everyone except the chief radio-telegraphist, Sir Alencar Neves, had given us up for dead long ago. I'm afraid our homecoming was a disappointment to them. Sir Alencar offered us all the comforts of his home, including, which was perhaps most important just then, the delights of an excellent cuisine at the hands of his charming wife. We were able to get away from the beans and jerked beef and rice and of the settlers. Not that we doubted the nutritive value of this diet, but we just could not take the excessive condiment accompaniment. The irrepressible vanity of women led Norma to weigh herself on the freight scales of the Air Force. Life with the savants had reduced her weight by 27 pounds. It would have been even more if she had not recovered a few lost pounds in our last camp when food had become more plentiful. She looked back with regret to our days in Rio when she had declined to touch a melba, sundae, or coconut, and whipped cream or milkshakes because she wished to preserve her figure. She promised that she would make up for that abstemiousness, and I can vouch for the fact that as soon as we got back to Rio, we surely did. For my part, I left the balance strictly alone. One look at my belt was enough, with all those extra holes I had to make in it to keep my trousers from falling down. Father Pedro went off again to fetch more provisions for the mission. Days passed peacefully, and the rest was a tonic to us. Our wounds and sores, which had been raw and open for months, were closing up under a healthy new skin. Adequate diet and plenty of rest were achieving what the most powerful antibiotics could not do, providing defenses for the body to cure itself. When we left Savantina, after shaking hands most cordially with our hospitable friend Alencar Neves, and our plane was flying away from that landscape, of the deep green of the jungle and the intense blue of the sky, we both felt that part of our hearts would remain forever in that territory of the Mato Grosso. We had penetrated into a strange, bewitching world, not only because of its inhabitants' extraordinary way of living, but because, for all their primeval simplicity, they possessed something which our civilization has almost forgotten: purity of thought, uncontaminated morality, and sincerity devoid of sophistication.